And in fact, I actually was able to get a 4-year scholarship through the Navy, Naval ROTC, to attend any school of my choice, and I chose UC Berkeley. I chose architecture as a major because I thought it would combine art and science. Science I was pretty good at, but I didn't care much about. The art I really loved. I thought I was going to become some kind of artist, but this looked practical. This turned out to be a huge error. I learned there was much more to architecture than just drawing pictures and the like, and so I just had a very difficult, bad time at Berkeley that first year. It was huge, too, to me. It was 19,000 students then, which is not that big, but I thought it was just overwhelmingly large. I also was deficient in some courses because my high school was so little it didn't have all the right classes and the rest. So after being raised by a 16-year-old mom and all the rest, and that's a story in itself because she still lives in the state of Washington, which is where she was born. And we've had more of a brother-sister relationship. You do, you know, if you're that close in age. It's been a different kind of thing from what probably most of you experienced from your moms. At any rate, off I was to college and finding myself doing things I never thought I would do before. After the first year, then, I came back to Arizona, gave up the scholarship because I told them I wanted to major in soil science, which was offered at Berkeley. The advisor was a fellow named Ken Babcock, a well-known expert in thermodynamics. But the Navy said, well, soil? We don't exactly need that in the Navy, so why don't you do chemistry? I said, well, I want to do soil chemistry. And so they sent me away because they said, well, we just cannot continue your scholarship. So I went to Arizona where, of course, I could go to school essentially for nothing, and I enrolled in the soil science program there, and I graduated with a degree in agriculture with an emphasis on soil, and that was getting me started. However, I was told at the time that chemistry did not apply to soil because it was too complex. The system was just impossible to describe with any kind of chemical tools. And so I didn't really think too much of chemistry per se. I liked physics a lot from high school and so forth. I stayed on for a master's because I met a professor named Dwayne Anderson who was quite a good mentor. He left soon after to take up several positions, and he worked in soil physics. And then off I went to try Berkeley again. I decided to apply there because Babcock was this expert in thermodynamics. I was reading books that said thermodynamics was very important if you wanted to study natural materials, and so I decided to do that. And when I arrived, he said, well, you're welcome here. However, I want to let you know that I don't believe in research grants, and so I don't have any. And therefore, you'll have to fund yourself all the time you're here. I also can't offer you an office or desk or anything else, but you can get some lab space. So that kind of upset me, because I had a growing family, 2 kids, a third on the way, and it's not going to be too good here. So actually, I set about things to do stuff as quickly as I could, and only years later people told me this was unusual. For me, it was just a way of getting out of a place that I didn't think was very friendly for the second time. But my first semester there, I took my oral qualifying exam, and the next year after that, I finished my PhD up. So I actually had to petition to get out early because they had a rule that said you had to stay a certain number of months, and I didn't know that. So I said, oh, yeah, you have to do that. So, oh, okay. So I got out, and my professor said to me, well, it was a wonderful thesis you wrote, doing statistical mechanics and studying clays and so forth, which are parts of soils, but don't expect to get a job, of course. Nobody's going to hire you. And so they were right. It was absolutely correct. I wrote around and people said, well, we have no use for anyone who wants to do basic research on soil. You do applied research on soil. That's what you do. You study agriculture and things like that. So instead, I saw there were a whole lot of teaching jobs. There's yours truly teaching physics at a brand new liberal arts college in California called Sonoma State College. It was up in Sonoma County, which was gorgeous, and it seemed like a good place to go. And so there were lots of jobs around in that sort of teaching. I'd taken a few physics courses, not too many, but they needed someone badly because their physicists had suddenly resigned on them, like weeks before the semester was to start. And so even though they thought it was a big chance, they decided to take one on me. So I came and spent 9 years there teaching physics. And I really learned a lot about teaching. I had the time, because there was not a lot of research pressure, to teach myself physics and to begin to write in the physics literature. I'm showing a couple of papers from that period. I was very interested in low temperature physics. I actually sat in on the class at Berkeley on that. And it actually was a time, too, that I decided to prove to myself that I could do the physics, so I decided to do a couple of textbooks, and John Wiley published those in 1970 and 1976. One interesting thing about this photo, which I was just looking at for the first time, this actually is classical mechanics stuff. It's analysis of potential wells on the board. But look at this. That's a cigarette package and an ashtray. In those days, you could smoke in class. It was no big deal. Students sat there and had cigarettes while they listened to you lecture, and you put ashtrays out on the tables for them. Things have changed environmentally. I think when people say there's been no improvement in environment, you need to look at some of these old pictures. There's a great 1928 photo of Huntington Beach in Southern California with oil derricks all over the beach, huge oil, just a forest of them, and people all bathing down below just as if nothing were there. I mean, there's been a lot of change. It's just that it's been gradual. So this was very nice. During that period of time, however, is when you've already been hearing about it in the 70s, when environmental consciousness was really, really being raised. After a number of events, but in particular formation of EPA and the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, then a lot really was in the media about this, and people in physics wanted to be useful. I did. I wanted to be useful. And I realized that from my agricultural background and soils training, I had things that could be useful to this liberal arts school because they didn't have anyone who could teach these things. So I started teaching environmental classes, and that was quite rewarding. It was kind of a switch back for me, but it was in keeping with the times. And this was a very experimental school, so it was possible to do these things without upsetting the equilibrium too much. However, the vice president there, it's a small school, was very clear in telling me that I wasn't supposed to do much research. Teaching was the job. I had sometimes up to 5 classes per semester to give. I mean, it was a really big teaching load. But you really learn to teach that way. But I wanted to do the environmental work, so I started looking around for a different kind of job where I could do more research. And I saw there was an opening in the Soil and Environmental Sciences Department at UC Riverside, down in the southern part of the state, because a professor there had died suddenly, and they needed someone right away to replace him, and they decided they wanted someone to do fundamental work. Now, by this time, I was a full professor at Sonoma. It had become Sonoma State University. The job there was an assistant professor without tenure, and so I applied for that job. And the department chair, as it turned out, looked at my application and decided I was joking, and so he threw it away. He didn't show it to the search committee. I called to find out why I wasn't hearing anything back, and he happened to be out of town. And because he was out of town, they called on the search chair. The search chair called me and said, "I never heard of you. Did you apply?" I said, "Yes, I did." So let me find out. And then he discovered that the department head had decided for himself that my application couldn't be serious because who on earth would go from full prof to untenured assistant prof? And then he called me and said, "Oh, we found your application. It was in his desk drawer. He had just stuck it away. Are you really serious about it?" I said, "Yeah, if I like the job, I'll do it." So it turned out they'd already interviewed all the candidates they wanted, and they didn't like any of them. So they said, nothing to lose. And then it also turned out that this man who was the head of the search committee was the roommate in college of my major prof at Berkeley. So he thought, oh, one of Kenny's students, why not? Let's just take a chance on him. So I went down there and actually got the job. And so I went through the tenure process a second time. Took a giant pay cut, too, I might add. They didn't seem to mind doing that. And so I began to work then at UC Riverside, doing environmental work. And this is where I have to bring in another really important intervention. Not long after I was there, I was looking around for good things to do. They assigned me some work. They said, we want you to study sewage sludges because we've got a big project in this and we're worried about metals and all those sorts of things. So I began to read the literature carefully about everything I could in environmental chemistry, and particularly water chemistry. And I encountered the names of Sturm and Morgan, and particularly Morgan, actually, who was not so far away. And I saw his name attached to a computer speciation program which calculated chemical speciation called Reticule-2, which is an acronym. So I wrote him a little postcard and saying, do you think there's a chance I might be able to get a copy of that? Because I'd like to try adapting that to soil. And so a little while later, this booming voice on the telephone calls me up. Says, "Hi, this is Jim Morgan." It just scared me to death because, what, Jim Morgan? So I was quite frightened. But he said, "Well, if you want this, you can have it. We'll just send it to you. I'll get my student George Jackson to mail it to you. It's on on tape, of course. Nothing was on small media." So Jim sent me that, and he got me started. And then it was about 30 years ago, there was a meeting of a series of little workshops that we used to have on the West Coast. I learned this through a mutual friend at Scripps Institution, that there was this thing called West Coast Water Chemistry Workshop Conference. And WC cubed, and it was mostly water chemists, and it wouldn't be so bad to have a soil chemist involved. So I started attending these, and I went to one, and I saw these two characters sitting up front. I came a little bit late, and they were just talking away. It seemed like they had comments on every single thing, and I thought, I bet you that's Stumm and Morgan. And because I hadn't seen them before, and it was. They both attended. I think Werner was there on a visit to work on a different edition of their book together. During the meeting, in fact, there were some interesting things that happened. One key thing that happened, because I see Jim Davis here, in that meeting is, I believe, where you presented your PhD thesis. And what Jim had done was to take some data that one of Werner's associates had gathered, and which they'd already modeled using a certain model of absorption of a type I'll get more precise about here shortly. And it worked very, very well. And then Jim had taken these same data and used a model with entirely different premises, and it modeled beautifully. And yet the premises were very, very different chemically. And that was stunning. I remember when Werner started to ask you a question, it was almost like the earth was shaking, because it was quite disturbing to see that these data could be modeled by two such different models. And I recall you defended yourself pretty darn well there, and I think you may have gone off to be a postdoc with Werner after that. Well, that was very eye-opening to me. I thought, wow, you mean the models, like you can get more than one model to work for the same data? That seems very strange. And I resolved to myself to find out a lot more about that. During a break, Werner came to me and said, "I understand you're in soil chemistry. You're saying some interesting things in this meeting." I said, "So are you." And he said, well, who are the people in soil chemistry? Who should I know about? I thought of some names in Europe and so on, but I thought to myself, 5 years from now, I'm going to make it so you don't have to ask that question. And so actually 5 years later, Werner is here in this letter inviting me to come to a Gordon conference and speak on modeling of surfaces. And if you can, I don't know if you can see the letter from there, but he lays it out extremely precisely what exactly he wants me to say. So effectively he's saying, you come and you say these things and so forth. In fact, I remember at the Swiss meeting that you mentioned, not this one, I started talking at first about clays, and I could see the look of dismay because he wanted me to talk about oxides instead. And then I picked up oxides, and he brightened up. That meeting was in the first time was when I met Jerry there on leave, 1981. He was visiting there. You were at a computer, in fact, when I met you. And Werner was my host, and I was as poor as a church mouse then for various reasons. And